Welcome everyone. This is Tristan McGough, your philosopher at large. Today, we're wrapping up Selfology 101 with the synergy of self. That is, mastering the 7 intuitional ideas of self that we have been discussing for these last 8 episodes. Now, as you'll recall, what we did is we gave an introduction and a brief summary of what we were going to cover in session 1, and then from then on, we've taken these concepts, which are actually unmentated. That is, you don't have to intellectually apprehend these ideas. They're not concrete ideas. They're the forms of all the ideas that we form in regards to this world. In other words, they're the basic forms into which we pour the contents of our experience, whether it's through our willings, or it's through our feelings, whether it's through our thinkings, or whether it's through our doings. Any of these 4 modes of the self are comprehended within these pristine cognitions of self, which we all have. They're universal. They're not something that you have to learn. They are something which you can intuit directly when you apprehend them as a self-reflexive being, and you still yourself from any other distractions, and you're able to see these pristine cognitions as the kind of windows that frame each of our experience. The first one that we began with in the second session was omnos, the all. That's the all-encompassing. That's the entirety. And if you look at all of these ideas that we took successively, we were dealing with omnos in the first as the entirety. Throw anything into this cosmic hopper you can, including non-being, and it has to somehow be accounted for within the all. And then we discussed the idea of the self in terms of singularity, being an eon, or as I pronounce it, aeon. That is the one, and this one is only itself, where this is all itself. That is, omnos is all itself, and when we look at the self as only itself, that's the aeon. Now, reality is when we're taking reality as a whole and simply looking as it is, as itself. That's the factuality of the world. In the same way that factuality constitutes another comprehensive idea of self, the real, as the aeon encompasses the singularity and omnos, the entirety. And the next we considered the idea of self in terms of the cosmos. That is the whole, an ordered whole. It's all-inclusive. So that all-including is in itself. That's the totality. Nothing can be in itself except the totality. The totality of everything. The one and only, sole and single, all and everything of nothing, pure being, finite being, and conscious being, all of that, it must be included within the whole. Then we considered what most of us think of as the starting point of self, and that is oneself. Oneself is a conscious being, and this is cognos. This is the self that is for itself. And this, fundamentally, the power of cognos is the power of omnicity. It is simply saying this: for anything that is, it is known at some level. We spoke of this at the transcendent level in terms of the agnostic self, the highest self, the spiritual self, and we spoke of that all discerning for itself in terms of infinite possibilities of appreciation through the aesthetic sense, and of moral development through the archaic or moral sense, the sense of reality and the discovery of the verities, the truths of this world as they are, the all-discerning aspect, as well as being able to clearly discern the energies of the world that are interactive. We spoke next of that self as it is a self-reflexive being taking hold of itself, and that's going into itself. That's the psychonaut or the pilgrim. This is the wanderer, the samsaran. This is the individual that is the fool on the journey of the tarot of life, where you are moving from ignorance to wisdom, where you are moving from ineptitude to power, where you are moving from being a victim of this causal and temporal and spatial and entity world and becoming its victor as a sovereign. And it's one where you unfold as the psychonaut the powers not only of your pathos, which is the eros, that is where you experience desire and its fulfillment from your personal point of view, but also agape, where you have a sympathetic feeling with other sentient beings, and it extends beyond the perimeters of what you identify with in terms of yourself and its ownership in this finite world. But that all expanding character of the psychonaut is indicative of it being a microcosm of the macrocosm. As above, so below. As below, so above. There is nothing that is not here, that is not everywhere. And with that idea in mind, we're looking at the synergy of self, of taking all of these ideas and leading to the adip, which is all-encompassing, and that is by itself. This is the synergy, where here is agency, and here we have omnicity. That is, we have the ever-growing, ever-increasing ability of consciousness to expand, which is exactly when it takes its self-reflective nature and goes, well, now I'm not just going to be self-reflective and know that I am. I'm going to shape what I want to become. And that's the kind of transformation that takes place here as the all-expanding. And so as the universe expands, each of us expands. From moment to moment, within the ephemeral now, the eternal now is the ephemeral moment. Everything that is transpiring here in terms of change is nothing but an activation of potential that always was. The words that I'm speaking to you at this very moment, the thoughts that I'm thinking, your thoughts and feelings, and everything that is going on in the crucible of your own conscious experience. All of that was contained within the singularity, which we call the aeon. And if you take a macrocosmic point of view and say there was a big bang, and at one point there was a singularity, just a protile of infinite density, all the potential, including all the phonics that I'm utilizing here and the syllables by which I'm dividing up my English learned language, all of that was contained within that protile. Of course, that's part of monadology or protology, which belongs to the study of the aeon, and which we touched on. But when you take all of these 7 intuitional ideas that are intrinsically part of our consciousness as conscious beings, you have the greatest omniversal depth, God. And that consists, of course, of the ground which we were speaking of, which is the infinite Godhead, which involves itself. It becomes involutional and involves itself from infinite being into finite being, which we know as nature. So we move from Godhead to Godhood. In the Eastern and Western traditions, that's looked upon and often allegorized, or if you will, personified as father and as mother. And the two of those together create the cultural being that we call the child. A human being is a culture-bearing being. And this is nothing more than the externalization, that is, culture and all its material and all its systems and techniques and methodologies and norms and ideas, all of its accumulated information, knowledge, and systematized encyclopedic form and accessible by any kind of intelligence grasping mechanism that's available and that we can develop. That's all part of culture. And that's godlike. You're unfolding the innate powers that are within you, and these in turn help you to evolve into what I call as the utopia. And here you take your transfinite experience, that is, all the experiences that are going on within you as a psychical being that are continuous and unified and part of your personal self. All of these things as well have, of course, an energetic basis within the universe. And it is as if you were just simply experiencing your own internal states, as if I'm moving my body and not affecting the material realm around me. Every time I move my body, whatever I do in this outside world, I have an impact on it. I can influence it. In the same manner that I have internal psychic states, these are all formed out of energetic matter, which is a finer grade of material substance within this universe. And that as well has a ripple effect. Just like my body has an influence on this level of concrete matter, there are subtler levels in which every body, literally, every vehicle, whether it's your emotional or it's your physical, whether it's your energetic or vital, or your mental, or your intuitional, or your willing, the atmic side. We've covered these and we'll touch upon these again. All of that is having an impact, a universal impact. And that resonance together is what I call the metafinite. And this is the thing that attains godship. That's the true adult. That's the true individual who no longer is a child, no longer dependent simply on the grounded nature, but has taken that grounded nature, which has created the spiritual being we call the human being, which allows them to utilize that as a child and all the potentials and to take it into actuality. It's all founded, of course, upon the four quadrants. The self is based upon the four quadrants. You're talking about the aeon. And here we have, again, the infinite conscious being, as we have the pure impartite being here and the conditioned or finite being, as well as non-being, the absence of being. So it's all these four ingredients that go into the construction of any reality. And that reality can either be our universe, which I've represented here as the macrocosm and the microcosm and the minicosm. That is, there is everything within the universe, then there are each of us as parts of the universe, and then there are parts within the parts, which our bodies are constituted and allows us to have mobility on any given plane. The map of the universe is nothing more than the self ontologized, in which it turns its potentials into the actuals of being, which are inherent within itself. And if we look at the cognography of human existence, we're looking all the way from the infinite down to the finite and the transfinite between, in which we clearly understand that here on the physical plane, there's also inside, so it appears, that is, so we interpret it according to the finite images of this world perceptually. Often it's perceptually that we take our images and we transpose them into higher planes so that there's some kind of analogical understanding. The emotive is like that, in which the imagination functions as well as the appetites. And these, of course, are accessible not only during dreams and daydreaming, but are always in play within your life as desires and hopes and wishes and fears and avoidances. There's the mentive, and the mentative or the mentive aspect of the intellectual realm contains both the memories as well as all the language and the other things that relate to it, and the senses, the conceptual and semiotic and episodic memories, where you remember your episodes, or conceptually, where you know what the meaning of words are, or you know what the meanings of different things are in paintings, or of anything that you wish to ascribe a concept to. And that's different than your semiotic memory, which is your ability to linguistically call upon what is really a semantic capacitance within you. That is, it allows you this capacity to utilize at any given moment in order to explain yourself. All of this, from the finite through the transfinite to the infinite, it's a matter of balance for the human being, which we've discussed before. And here we represented it, I believe it was the last time I pulled this out, about the universal spinning top. And that is the 14 levels of samsara. You take your 7 planes, that is the aeonal, cognal, intuital, egoic, mentive, emotive, and physical. And you divide those according to, such as the physical, there's the vital aspect, the etheric body as it's called in theosophy. And then there's the biotic aspect. And this, of course, all relates to our universe. There are other universes within the multiverse in which the paraverse, which is the infinite fount of unexhaustible energy, which always remains unexhausted, always remains inexhaustible, ineffable. It is something to which we refer in terms as the omnus, or the entirety, as it's captured, one might say, before manifestation. But manifestation is always occurring somewhere. The paraverse and the multiverse in our particular universe are always at some state of play. However, it's the paraverse that remains unexcelled, unconditioned, always ready for tappability, for being called upon. At this very moment, the paraverse, if you will, underlies every single possibility that occurs within our universe. And that's the same within any multiversal dimension in which we skew through imagination and say, well, that universe over there, that part of the multiverse must be the same, except in that one, I'm wearing a red shirt. Or in another multiverse, it's a blue shirt. In another multiverse, it's an orange shirt, and it's a paisley, etc. We can utilize our imagination in order to access these counterparts to our universe. Does that mean that they actually exist? Of course, they do not exist according to our universe, because our universe is a coherent set of causational laws and karma. Things work out according to cause and effect here, not just space and time, cause and effect, as well as the entities which are always transpiring into another state because they are involved within the vortex of being. And for us, it is the vortex of the conscious set, where right at this very moment, there is a converging consciousness of 4 different things that are happening. There's something that's emerging in each of our consciousnesses at this very moment, and that's blended into that part of the converging consciousness. In the same way that there's a submerging consciousness. My language is used and then it falls, flows, and is, if you will, substructured, sublayered, sedimented for the future, in which it may be part of my enfolding consciousness. It was what was enfolded and I will utilize again. But there's also an unfolding consciousness. There are potentials of which we have no idea, but upon which is based our very being, such as the potential of vital energy for every one of us, our life, the potential for feeling, which is part of our heart, our feeling affective apparatus, but part of our intellective apparatus is, of course, the insight-making device of the mind, and that is our thinking part. That is always unfolding. There's always something new that is occurring. Consciousness, like being, does not stand still. It is conscious being. If we look in terms of the vortex of the conscience set, we know that whatever is unfolding becomes part of the entanglement. It is what we have to deal with in the future because it is part of what now is the foundation. Pardon me. And in the same manner, the unfolding consciousness, which leads to eudaimonia, the more that you unfold and achieve and fulfill, remember in terms of the true, the beautiful, the good, and the one, the more happy, that is, the more harmonic this vortex, this vortexal experience that you are as a conscious being will have. Now, what is the emerging consciousness? Well, it's what's becoming an experience for the expansive, the free subject. In other words, at the spiritual end, the emerging consciousness is that which never was, and it's now becoming to be. It's the point where the potential is transiting into the actual as a consciousness process. That is occurring as a converging consciousness with all the others. It isn't as if a vortex exists linearly, although when we apply our bifurcated thinking to the world where there's a here and a there, there's a now and a then, and a now and a future, we look at it in terms of that liminal consciousness, and we see the emerging consciousness leads to the submerging consciousness. Now, that idea of leading to isn't necessarily a linearity, however we can represent it that way, quite simply, in the same way that we represent a vortex as all these lines that appear to be giving the sense of dynamic swirl. So, our subliminal consciousness is that which is unfolded and becomes part of the very thing we are entangled with. That's our samskaras. That's our predispositions. That's our volitional formations that continue to take us from one point to another. However, all of this, of course, we're talking about as if that's just an actuality and all this is actually occurring at one time. But as we look at the 6 modalities of reality that constitute that one fact, we see that reality is not only the irreversibility of an actuality, but to begin with, remember that protale at the beginning of the Big Bang? That was all part of the ideality. There's a certain continuity that allows all of these modalities to coexist so that what has now actually happened doesn't necessarily mean that there isn't the necessity or the contingency of cause and effect, nor the possibility or its probability of occurring. Any of these events at any given time has all these modalities that are present with it that constitute its reality, right along with the 4 ingredients. In fact, this is the way, the modalities, by which these ingredients get mixed. However, the mixing of these ingredients is not haphazard, is it? There is a productive causation, but there's also, we discussed, a generational causation. And that is something that is based upon the epistemic relation of the universal correlation between the experiencing subject and the experienced object. These two things, the object which is out there and the subject that is in here, we're using depictive terminology here. We're not necessarily describing a 3-dimensional reality when I'm doing subject to object, right? What we're talking about is apperception, attention, and apprehension. When I apprehend anything, there's that subject-object experience. However, that apprehension is called an interject. It's not the subject, me, by myself. It's not that object, uncontacted. It's when I, as a subjective experiencer, have the experience of this objective object, or a subjective internal object if I'm thinking or feelings about something. Either way, that subject-object correlation and contact creates an interject. That interject is not only what you are experiencing as a noia, that is as an idea, as a feeling, as a thought, as a resolution or deliberation to a resolution on the part of will, or as something which is the vital doing or acting that you have in any of the dimensions, because your emotions are active as well as your mentations, as well as your intuitions. Remember, you are an agent. As an agent, you're not just an observer and watcher, you're also a direct actor. You are somebody who is performing and mentating and originating all your own experience. And so what is occurring in terms, as we said, of taking all these different modalities and mixing up the four ingredients of reality, remember, from the infinite right here to the finite of our universe and to my local manifest world and yours as well. These are all occurring according to production. Cause, effect, consequence, and result. You can see that we call that the pancrux. That is the way the finite world interacts with one another, and that's the kind of, if you will, a transitive causality, where there is influence of one object on exterior to another. It's unlike that with intra-agent causality, where I'm the one that creates my own thoughts, I create my own sentences, I create my own actions, right? I do all of this. I generate it in terms of that subject-object correlation. But even beyond that, there's the Erlu. This out here is the Melu. Inside is the Perlu. However, what unites all of it is the Erlu. You are, like the city, the foundation. It's the greater scape. It's not just my inner scape. It's not this outer scape. It's the greater scape. It contains all of it and much, much more. It's not just what's manifested here. It is a great deal more, because it's not just the physical and what's manifested here in solid three-dimensional form. We know from science that below that visible, tangible, macroscopic form, the Rupa world out here, there are subtler and subtler worlds as we move through the subatomic spectrum of energies that combine to create the constitutions which we visibly look upon as a concrete world. But the ageless wisdom, the perennial philosophy, and all the various tributaries thereof all speak of more subtle layers of energy, including our emotional, which is what is motivated. It isn't as if these are stratified. You can't have the physical unless you have the emotional and the mental and the egoic and the intuitive. These higher always penetrate. The greater always includes the lesser, right? In the same way that the subatomic world is that from which this world of manifest material matter is generated. That's what's here. I mean, right in this finger, it's not just this visible finger, right? You take the human body and you get rid of all the electromagnetic and other nucleated forces between it, and it is a size of the speck of dust, the whole human body. Take out all the electromagnetic maya, and that's all it is. So what we are experiencing on this outer world can be explained in very, very many ways. And the deeper you go, the higher you fly. The greater the apex that you attain on that mountaintop, the more you're going to see. But of course, it isn't enough just to see the world. You have to experience it. And that's why you have the empiric self, the self that's involved in a finite world. But that presupposes you have an epistic self, that is a soul, a being that has intra-agent causality, that is its own continuity. All of this, as we said, whether it's the cognography, or you look at it in terms of ontology, and that these are all fields of energy, it is, as we pointed out, all a single emanation, and that's the emanational causation. That's the heirloom. Like the generation is your own individual heirloom, which you, as a transcendental ego, are able to step back from the world and say, you know what? I've got my own thoughts and nobody knows what's going on out there except me in here. That's your privatized area. That's your privy consciousness. However, all of it is occurring at the same time. It doesn't matter whether it's your consciousness or my consciousness or all the consciousnesses together. There's a crucis and a catenna. That is, there is a point, a crucis, in which all of this comes together. Whether it's the collective karma of a nation and the individual karmas of every single individual person in that nation, or whether it's the historical karma that's combined with that, or the global karma, which is an extension of collective karma, all of it together is rule-bound. And that is why we are speaking of terms of the anacrusis, which is the collection of causes and conditions by which an event occurs and then produces the consequences and the results that we speak of as the extension of the actual effect. However, all of it is happening within a singular moment, and that is the eternal now. And we can express that eternal now as the ephemeral moment, which is the 50-factor fact. Every fact that is occurring right now has 50 factors. Let's just take one of them. Let's just look, for instance, at the apex. That's ipseity. Ipseity is a thing being identical to itself. It is self-identity, so to speak. And that is expressive as a syzygy, that is two things which seem to be polar opposites but are truly one. There is the all one, which we've spoken of as the omnos in its entirety, and then there's the a one, which of course we refer to as the aeon. And right there we have two of the pristine cognitions that we all intrinsically share as conscious beings. And as conscious beings, each one of us, in terms of the systemics of transfinity, are a point from which we are pivoting in the world. And this is an essential aspect of what it means to be human. We, as a central point, are an agent. Remember, as an agent, we are the actor I, as well as the watcher I. So, we have an active and a passive part of us, and they are always co-conterminous, they're coterminous, they're co-eval, they're coincident, they're co-present. They cooperate and they're co-founded. So that is what in essence constitutes the subject, the point. However, that point can assume one of three different focal settings, and we spoke of this. If it's a finite setting, that's the empirical self, that's your personality. Everything you do is done in discrete segments and bites and chunks. There are sections, there are scenes, right? There's a series. All of it can be divided. That's the finite world. When you have a focal setting in consciousness of that finite world, it's called the person or the empirical self. The empiric self for short. And it depends on how you pivot, because as consciousness, you can pivot. You're the dynamic radial point that emerges from here. And you can pivot toward feelings, you can pivot toward actions, you can pivot toward information that you want to learn, you can pivot to applying what you've learned, you can pivot any which way that you like as a conscious being. In fact, as the synergic self, that is, if you ideally were to represent in graphic form how the synergic self as the kayak self, that is, as the spirit, soul, and soma, as the anasic, epistic, and empiric selves, all three of those working together, without words, it would look like this, in which, of course, you have your entire sphere of infinite consciousness, and inside you have the anasic element, which contains the epistic element, which contains the empiric element. At the center of all of it, you can pivot any which way that you like. For instance, with the empiric self, it's limited. It doesn't have that complete range. It has that potential to have that complete range. However, as an empiric self, its radii only extend to its finite limits. As the epistic self, it extends to its transfinite limits. And that's as the transcendental ego. But as the transcendent ego, it can extend all the way as the anasic self to every part. If you look, therefore, at all three of them together, the kayak self is composed of the anasic self, the spirit, in which is contained all your potentials, all your intuitive senses, as we've mentioned, all your tensionality, such as apperception, that is, consciousness immediately apprehending itself in a non-dualistic fashion. It isn't as if the self-consciousness, in terms of apperception, has to turn itself into an object as it does in reflection. That's not what apperception is. Apperception is the transparency of consciousness combined with the reflexivity of consciousness. Consciousness is immediately transparent to itself and it reflects itself in such a fashion. That is apperception. That is the essence of the anasic self. Just as attention, where you place your attention as a transfinite being, is the core of your epistic self. As, in terms of awareness, your apprehension of an external object or an internal object that you visualize or that you semanticize, that's part of your empiric self. That's part of the finite experiences that are chopped up and that you experience as the ephemeral moment. Regardless, when you take all of this together, the kayak self, that of course is what we've talked about as being human. That is the human being. That is the spiritual, personal, and natural part of all of us, because we exist here in the material plane in terms of our animality as an empiric self. But as an epistic self, that is the essence of our humanity, in that we can liminalize our experience and pay attention to it. The anasic self is our supraliminal capacities that allows us to eventually discover the fundamental unity that unifies us all. Why does it unify us all? Because that's part of the karma-verse. All of it as a well-ordered system of three types of causation: emanation, generation, and production. And they relate to the three realms: infinite emanation. There will never stop being emanation of infinity. Transfinite generation. There will never be a time where you have a conscious being and that they are not generating transfinite experiences, where they are taking the grist of the finite world and putting it against the backdrop of their experiencer as a subject, as they're pulling from the infinite world, combining them both into what essentially is the human being. But the human being, of course, has their individual karma, but then there's the physical karma of this world. And then we talked of the collective karma that we all share as family members and as clan members and as members of a neighborhood, and it goes on and on and on in concentric circles. That's all part of your collective karma. But all of this, wherever we operate at any given time within the universe, on any particular planet, in any of its eras, that has a kind of historical karma in which the present forces that are here are the result of a long history, a legacy of energy that has been solidified, remember, through the enfolding consciousness so that it will re-emerge. If it re-emerges as patterns, it's because of karma, the repetitive aspect where what we've taken and enfolded will once again re-emerge at some point when the objects, the cues, the environments, and everything else is right. That's why it's so important that the karmaverse, which is the law-bound universe that we live in, is made use of. That making use of is the virtue verse. What is virtue? Virtue essentially is the power to take a potential and turn it into an actual and keep it an actual. And that conscience is the merit accumulator. The things that you do, the good things that you do, hold together because they're harmonic. They balance one another, they feed off one another, they support a structure. If you didn't have a harmonic structure, such as a harmonically made building by a professional architect, chances of it not working to its optimal efficiency are high. In fact, it would probably collapse if you don't know what it is that you're doing in the same way. That's what conscience is. It is building your character. And we spoke of, very quickly to summarize again, that the best way to grab this whole concept of virtue and taking hold of yourself to master Maya is looking at what are natural virtues. In other words, if you entertain these thoughts, feelings, motivations within yourself, you won't really have to worry about doing anything except riding the crest of the wave of karma, your good karma. So virtues by nature, they're eunoia. They make you feel good. They complete your being. Remember this, happiness is harmony. So it's the harmonious energies and aspects and faculties of your body that are working together that are naturally virtuous. Such things as clarity of mind, calmness, generosity, gratitude, and fruits of the Spirit, like love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. Plus curiosity and vigilance and conscientiousness, non-ignorance, non-attachment, non-aggression, all of these things are natural virtues. And when you as a conscious being entertain them as your interjects, as what's present in your consciousness, then your mind becomes a virtuous main mind, and that's known as an associated virtue. So as you practice clarity of mind, as you practice, for instance, diligence and vigilance in your daily doings, and conscientiousness in the way that you treat other sentient beings, your mind naturally will now have an associated virtue. That in turn becomes a seedling virtue, which becomes a cause for future actions based upon habituation. You can habituate yourself to things which are unsuitable, often called bad, and things which are suitable and very resilient, which we usually refer to as good. And these causal virtues then become the seeds by which you can actually enact or construct virtue. It's motivated virtue. You're motivated to say something kind. You're motivated to alleviate someone's anguish, you see. This all leads to creative virtue. That is, in our local universe, you can actually create power with other people. That's the secret of collectivity and collective power. The more people that you have motivated and energized and acting in a virtuous manner, remember virtue essentially means power, powerful energy, and it's due to a capacity that has been developed. That leads to awakened contributions to Newtopia, to the socioverse, the universe of conscious beings. That led us last time, as you remember, we discussed about the master of the message. And mastering the message is basically a matter of merit. Merit as the mastery of Maya, so that you have the master standing at the center, who's also the skillful hero. What does the skillful hero have? Well, she has power. Not the absence of power, but actual power. So that's one of the ingredients. But also, they're a seer of reality. They see reality as it is. They know things. They're not ignorant. They're not afraid to look. That helps balance the power. Because if you can clearly see what that power will lead to in terms of cause and effect, then you are a skillful hero. You are somebody who can apply energy in a judicious fashion in order to create an exact result. And in terms of becoming a master of the message, one who knows Maya and its magic, you become the creator. You become a method actor, if you will. You have a particular recipe that you can follow that leads to creative results. This is the methodical cultivator of virtue and abandoning not virtue. And what is non-virtue? Non-virtue are things that make you ineffectual. They're the cis formations. Enslavement, enthrallment, enfeeblement, enchantment. These are things that keep you spinning in the cycle of samsara rather than spiraling along the axis of evolution. When you learn to do that, you become a master, and you become a mythic lover as well, with sympathetic loving through non-attachment. You let agape rather than eros. Eros is your teacher. It teaches you what's valuable and precious. Agape is the feeling that what is precious to me is precious to you. And so I am insistent upon appreciating that preciousness within you and caring for it. That's what the mythic lover is. So you're a seer of reality, skillful hero, mythic lover, and magical creator. In short, you're a miracle worker. You're somebody who is a merit maker in this world. You do good. You do something that's beautiful. You do things which are true, authentic to form. And you use power in a resilient fashion so that it harmonizes with the environment and synergizes it to unfold more into a future where the potential becomes actual. So you're actually a merit fount. That is, you're an active mystic. Whether you like it or not, you become an active mystic. And in terms of our 7 ideas, what really has happened is that as an active mystic, you've realized the nature of the aeon, the one. And that singularity from which you act has been brought about by you as a pilgrim, being creative, as a magical creator. But probably it all began, as it all begins with all of us as cognos, as the self-reflective human being, which we are, the seer of reality. Eventually, we see what is true from what is false. Eventually, we see what is important and significant emotionally from what is fleeting and absolutely evanescent. The cosmos is actually where you as the mythic lover embrace the whole. You see that the tricosm of the macrocosm and you as a microcosm and all the minicosms that constitute your various body and ingredients, all of these are part of the one whole. They're part of that totality, and that's what you embrace. This is the passionate romance that mystics have with the world. And reality. You face reality, and that's the only way you become someone with the skillful means to become a true hero and to care for someone in the manner in which they need the caring for. And right at the center, the master is the omnos and all, just as parousia, the adept, the miracle worker, the one who now contributes actively to this world in which we live in a positive, constructive, and future-forwarding fashion. That is the individual who is the adept. And that is synergy. That is the universe using itself. That's what an adept is. It's the universe using itself. All of that, of course, signals there's a reason for this. The reason is occurring all the time. That source of which we spoke of as the active mystic, the one, the aeon, that's the source with two arcs. It's going on right now. In terms of our universe, we looked upon the involutionary arc, and now we are part of the evolutionary arc. In fact, we could say from the point of the Big Bang onwards, as a macrocosm, we're evolving. However, there was a long time in the creation of that protile. And of course, even science speaks of the Big Bang, but then there's the Big Crunch. And then the theories go on that there's a big bounce, and that there will be another Big Bang that will lead off to another universe. And of course, this is exactly the Hindu cosmology that is thousands of years old. It is spoken of and outlined within the Indian scriptures of the Asiatic continent, in which Lao Tzu says, the 10,000 things rise and fall while the self watches their return. They grow and flourish and then return to the source. Returning to the source is stillness, which is the way of nature. The way of nature is unchanging. And that's from the eastern side of the planetary brain. If we go to the Occident, to the western side of the global hemisphere, we have Heraclitus, the great Greek philosopher who lived just a little after Lao Tzu there, around 5 BC. And he says the way up and the way down are one and the same. All is change, only change is changeless. Well, here's Lao Tzu. The way of nature is unchanging. So this involutionary arc and this evolutionary arc, that is us as conscious beings being involved, involuted into the world with all its patterned energetic complications, which we call matter, which is nothing more than the metering of all that vortex. We eventually come to a point where we begin to evolve and unpack what it is that we've coalesced for experience. Because remember the mountain analogy at the beginning? It's not enough just to take an apexal view and look off into the valley. You want to go down and experience what that valley has, what the townsfolk are doing, something over at the local park. You want to become part of it, and that's where the empiric self comes in. But that source itself, as experience, is, as we said, that's the self, the will, love, mind, and life. Heart, life, mind, will, self. The 4 aspects we talk about is willing, thinking, feeling, and doing. all part of the intuitive networking of self's consciousness. If we are speaking of the involutionary arc as us, as conscious beings falling into the world of the organoverse, this is the material path where, remember, the 10 dimensions of self. Here we have the living, feeling, the identifying, willing, and thinking dimensions. They are what are doing the involving into the world. And they eventually become, through the epistic self, which is a formation of faculty that takes place on the evolutionary arc, then they become an enduring and imagining as well as an observing, presencing, and organizing set of dimensions. These are reversed on the evolutionary arc, in which you have all these, the living and the feeling and the thinking and the doing, the observing or perspectival selves. Those 5 now are completely situated in the world. And it's from there, as the empiric and epistic self, that you move back to the agnostic self with your continuing dimension, social dimension, the advancing dimension of the present, the unifying dimension, and of course, the synergic dimension, which is what? Which is where you begin as a conscious being to see things in a synergic or synergetic way. That things are involved with one another, and the whole is always greater than the sum of its parts. So in terms of that greatest omniversal depth, which we had referred to at the beginning of this program as God, now we see it as course of self. These are all 7 of the ideas that we have taken, whether it's omnos, aeon, cosmos, ontos, cognos, the pilgrim, the psychonaut, or the adip. All 7 of those together lead us to the greatest omniversal depth of these 4 ingredients of reality, of pure being, finite being, conscious being, and non-being, as they are mixed within the threefold causational network of emanation, generation, and production. They unfold. The ground unfolds, the omniverse through cosmogenesis into inserting itself, that is, as the transcendent in the immanent, which here is referred to as accession. This is the full involution that takes place. The psychogenesis in nature in which eventually all life begins to emerge from what appeared to be inorganic forms. The evolution and the anthropogenesis of the development of the human being. The egogenesis, where not only is the human being developed, but the ego is literally giving birth to a new universe. Then there comes, of course, the culture, which is the organization of the material and of the nomic world of values and rules and laws and norms and folkways, which leads us to civilization, in which self-like, the child, the Christ and the Savior, now starts to take material form with social forms of collective consciousness and institutions. We've reached a point, obviously, where we're at globalization. Even the conflicts that transpire today underscore the interdependencies that have been established as part of our historical karma. None of that will go away. The trend towards globalization is an inevitable one as we reach toward a unification of consciousness. This is all transformation, which of course balances the involution, which is at any point taking place. Although we, as a globe, maybe experience this planetarization of karma. Not every single planet is. Like individuals, planets and other groupings have karma. This leads, of course, to the utopian eudaimonia, the happiness, that innate goal toward which we all transpire. And then there is the the socioverse and hologenesis. Hologenesis is where you are recognizing that you are part of a whole. That whole itself is not something which is independent of you. You and it are not only interdependent, there is, of course, the multiverse which extends beyond that. So hologenesis is the realization of the universe as part of this multiversal network and of its paraversal underpinnings. This leads to an appreciation of all conscious life, where there is not just simply rights guaranteed to human beings, but there are rights which are recognized with all sentient beings within the socioverse, which leads eventually to that great harmony, which is a cosmic happiness, at oneness, which is henosis. Henosis is the sense of prevailing unity that has been fully enculturated, manifesting nature in a harmonic fashion, and fully potentiating the ground into actual experiences. This concludes Selfology 101. In the future, what I'm going to do is take various cognostic cards, and we're going to deal with them within a series on Selfology, in which we will expand the teaching into an intermediate level. So until that time, behave when you must. Be good whenever you can, but above all else, be yourself.